Martonis continued to walk down the back halls. He was really beginning to tire of them, though they weren't nearly as bad now that Henley's illusions were broken in his mind. He made his way past several scrambling attendees and members of the waitstaff. He heard and then saw a large Orden woman barking orders at her underlings. She spun around and confronted him.
"And just where do you think you're going?"
"I'm with the Ministry of Investigation. Please stand aside."
"Oh, I don't think so."
"Ma'am, I'm sure you heard the scream earlier. There is a killer on the loose, and I venture to say that I am one of the few people in attendance to this party that may be able to stop him. If you don't get out of my way, I will move you."
He felt Reaper moving within his head, and noticed his sight expand significantly as Reaper caused his eyes to glow deep red for effect. The Orden woman gulped deeply and looked around herself.
"Oh, here's Atlas. You're one of them. All right. But if you cause any trouble, you'll have me to deal with. Got it?"
"Got it,"
he said as he pushed past her towards the ornamental door at the end of the hall.
The eyes were a nice touch.
"You are not nearly as intimidating as you think. Not without me, at least."
Noted.
He reached the door and pushed it open, stepping into the room beyond. The room glowed with a brilliant pale blue light, emanating from the two pools of power in the middle of the room. Floating several feet above them was a tall, dark-skinned woman with power radiating from her. She snapped her pale purple eyes open and took him in. "Who are you, and how did you get back here?"
"The name's Martonis. I take it you're the warden."
"Answer my questions, human." "I will not ask again." He noticed the short posts of bone on her head and her odd-shaped ears.
"An Elkin? Interesting. I'm with the Ministry of Investigation. There's a killer loose in this building, and I'm trying to stop him. As to how I got back here, the steward let me pass."
"Filthy Bashan."
"I forgot to ask her specifically, but most Orden don't like being called that name."
"Leave."
"Not going to happen. If we have any hope of beating this guy, we need to work together."
"Me and my paladins are more than capable of dealing with any threat."
"Oh, you mean like the paladin I just saw getting nearly decapitated a few minutes ago?"
Ellen Shia hated everything that the ministry stood for. They were an affront to Broken, twisting and changing his words to justify their terrible actions. Yes, they were crucial in keeping the Empire together, but the Paladinic Order could enforce order much easier without them constantly getting in the way. However, the ministry was very proficient at what it did, and she could tell by looking into this man's soul that he was telling the truth. That was what frightened her most. She shut her eyes and began to reach out to her paladins. "I still feel both of their souls."
"Well, a hemomancer consumed one."
She reached deeper and more frantically. She connected to one of them and saw the governor through his eyes. Good, they were still alive. She then searched for the other. She felt his soul and pushed against it, but was unable to feel or see anything more. She pulled back and instead focused on the sole of his armor. It wouldn't have eyes to see from, but it was attuned to her, and so she would be able to feel. The armor was still, slumped against a wall. She felt no life around it other than the small trace that emanated from the armor itself. She slowly opened her eyes. His name was Racine. He had a son.
"I'm sorry. Do you believe me now?"
"Yes." "Why are they attacking here?"
"Your boss is trying to take over the Empire. He's making a bid for Emperor as we speak."
A cold realization struck her. She knew that his greed knew no bounds, but Emperor? Would he really spit in the face of Broken so blatantly? I see. That scum cannot be allowed to take the throne.
Agreed. But we also can't allow this zealot to massacre everyone here. We can deal with Takaron later. For now, we need to focus on the subject at hand.
He will be coming for Takaron. If we pull him back here to the safe room, Perhaps the zealot will leave the rest of the guests alone.
I think that's our best bet.
Ellen Shia screamed out in pain as she felt the zealot try to tear away her control over his soul governor. Go! Get the governor! He's trying to break free. It will take everything I have to hold him back.
You expect me to fight with my hands tied?
She gave him a glare and reluctantly raised her hand to release his soul governor. The gems around it dimmed as the tether that tied it to both of their souls broke.
I'll be back.
Hurry! I don't know how long I can hold on. With that, he darted back out into the hall, leaving Ellen Shia alone, with the hardest struggle in her life and the memories of her friend. The paladins were discouraged from forming attachments to their fellow paladins, but after years of serving together, it was nearly impossible not to. He would be remembered, and once she killed that zealot and dragged Racine's soul from him, Racine would live on in his armor. That brought her comfort, though not nearly enough to quiet the fear that was building inside of her. Tatarin closed his eyes, remembering his mother and all of those he had lost along the way to get to where he stood now. On the other side of the door in front of him was a gathering of the most foul and evil creatures across the spheres, and at their head was his target. Well, they were all his targets. He had very clear instructions and intentions to not leave anyone alive. Despite what most people believed, however, he didn't actually enjoy killing. Of course, he liked the feeling of power that came from consuming souls, but unbeknownst to most, he didn't have to fully drain a person's soul. In fact, it was often better to leave them alive and maintain a blood bond. That way, their soul could continue to produce energy that he could siphon away. Once a soul was completely ripped away, it would stagnate. Keeping blood bonds active without killing the host was a delicate process and one that he had not mastered. Regardless, he had a task to complete. He would get revenge for the countless zealots who were slain in the name of Broken. He pushed the door open, and the bloodbath began. Dalen was still pondering his place in the universe when the screaming started. Henley had made it back to him just in time for a massive spike of solidified blood to ram straight through his upper abdomen. Dalen screamed, adding his voice to the symphony of terror that had just reached a crescendo. He looked around in shock and disbelief, watching the blood-red monstrosity tear through the crowd, stabbing and slashing his way through anything that stood before him. He might not be able to cast spells with his soul governor on, but that didn't stop him from creating spikes of blood and flinging them indiscriminately across the room, such as the one that was still protruding from Lord Henley's body. Henley reached out with a shaky hand and placed it on Dalen's shoulder, trying to stabilize himself. Dalen's shock evaporated in that moment, and he grabbed Henley and slowly lowered him to the ground. He tried to speak, but all that came out was air and blood. "Don't speak. Save your strength." Dalen began to cry. How had his life turned into this? His parents had always had such high hopes for him. Then when Henley had made him his ward, he felt as though he had finally made it. Now, he was holding the broken body of the man who had become like a second father to him in his arms. This was a nightmare, but Dalen knew deep down that it was much worse than that, because he would never wake up from it. "Dalen!" Henley was finally able to cough out. "It's okay, my lord. I'll find help. Lord Henley reached up to Dalen's face and grasped it with a strength that Dalen would have thought impossible to a man in his state. And then, Dalen woke up. Perhaps woke up is not the best way to describe it, as that would imply that everything was a dream and he was returning to reality. This felt more like the entirety of reality itself melted away, leaving nothing but void and devastation in its wake. In an instant, he knew everything and nothing. He knew that his entire life was a lie, that all of his memories were fake. He knew that he was nothing but a beggar and a street urchin, whose parents had thrown him away because he was too expensive to feed. He knew that Henley had manipulated and controlled him for as long as he could remember. He knew all of this, but knowing and understanding are two very different things.
I'm sorry, Dalen.
With that, he died. And with him, Dalen died too. Not his body or his soul, but his identity, his purpose. His mind broke, trying to piece together his memories, trying to justify what little he knew, trying to make sense of anything. He failed miserably. All that was left was a husk of a man, like that man he had seen in the washroom before, drained and lifeless. The screaming faded behind him. He didn't care about them. He didn't care about anyone. All he could do was sit there in the blood and stare blankly into the lifeless face of the monster that had stolen his life from him. Martonis burst out through the doors and onto the second-floor balcony, carnage raging below. The paladin guarding the governor spun around with his sword drawn and leveled it at him.
Easy, big guy. The warden sent me.
The paladin closed his eyes for a second and then nodded in confirmation. Martonis never understood how paladins and wardens were able to communicate telepathically, but he wasn't complaining.
And what are you supposed to be?
Takaran blurted out, clearly flustered by the massacre happening beneath them.
Someone trying to save your life. Well, not yours specifically, but that seems to be a byproduct. I'm going to be escorting you to the safe room.
Then what are you waiting for?
Martonis looked down into the sea of red below and locked eyes with the hemomancer.
That. Let's move.
The three rushed out from the balcony box and into the corridor leading to the safe room.
He's coming,
Reaper warned.
I'm counting on it,
he whispered under his breath. The further they pushed towards the safe room, the more the screams behind them faded. Whether that was due to them getting further away, or the fact that the hemomancer was now pursuing them instead of butchering the nobles, Martonis did not know. They soon reached the warden's chamber and pushed through into the room beyond, where Elenshia still levitated, pulling on the energy of the wells to try her best to keep the blood mage contained.
The level of incompetence of you and your staff is astounding, Elkin. I thought the Paladinic Order was better than this, but to let a blood zealot in and...
Get downstairs, or I swear to Broken I will kill you myself, Elenshia shouted in anger and annoyance, cutting the governor off. For the first time in his entire life, Martonis assumed, Takaran was speechless. With his mouth still open, Martonis pushed him forward and down the stairs leading to the safe room below. Martonis looked back at Elenshia, who nodded to him. He nodded back and continued to descend. As soon as they made it to the bottom of the stairwell, he closed and bolted the door shut. Then Takaran finally found his voice.
To think that horrid, broken, forsaken creature has the nerve to speak to me like that. At least you have your priorities straight, detective.
I think you misunderstand your current position in all of this, Governor. You aren't our priority. You're our bait,
Martonis responded. Takaran's mouth fell open once again, and with no snide remark to follow this time. The one remaining paladin stepped towards Martonis.
Let me be clear, Detective. I don't trust the Ministry, and I don't trust you. But for some reason, Elenshia does. So, that's good enough for me. For now.
He barked.
Understood.
The rest of the inhabitants of the room were Takaran's personal guard. They weren't paladins, which surprised Martonis. They seemed to instead be private mercenaries of some sort. Though he assumed they had seen combat before, he also assumed that an assignment such as this would breed laziness and complacency in such men. They seemed sloppy and undisciplined. Presumably, Takaran wanted as few ears and eyes witnessing his dealings and schemes as possible, unless he was directly paying them. Paladins and wardens would be supported by the state, and as such, they would not be able to be bought or paid off by the governor. Elenshia was most likely assigned to him against both of their wishes. She seemed rather prejudiced and prideful to Martonis, but her convictions seemed sincere. He doubted she would be able to hold off the zealot, but he hoped it would be enough. He sat in the corner of the room and closed his eyes, channeling energy from the veil, allowing Reaper to strengthen himself and Martonis for the battle. If it played out the way Martonis hoped, it wouldn't take much, but it was still better to be prepared. Ellen Shaya strained with all her might against the oppressive force that was pushing back against her. Every second, that force grew stronger, feeding off the souls that the Zealot had consumed. He would be here any minute, and she would not be ready. She could fight him, or she could keep his soul governor powered, but she could not do both. Not for long, anyway. And once the soul governor fell, he would be unstoppable. She had hunted and even killed hemomancers before, but she always had a number of steel eidolons under her control. There was something unsettling about using the enchanted suits of armor that had once belonged to friends that she had failed. But they were extremely effective, especially against heretics like the Blood Zealots. Unfortunately, they took time to awaken, so Racine's armor would not be able to help her now. She was alone. The screaming was inaudible now, and for a second the Zealot relented in his assault against his soul governor. Everything fell quiet. She gathered as much power from the wells as her soul could hold, preparing for the inevitable battle. In the silence, she heard a gentle trickle of blood, and watched a pool begin seeping under the door. He was there. Spikes of blood violently burst through the door, still attached to the creature on the other side. The spikes began to undulate and shred the thick wood of the door before ripping it completely off of its hinges and pulling it back into the darkness. The Zealot appeared in the doorway, and Ellen Shaya reached out and placed an invisible barrier between them. The Zealot raised his arm, where she could see a dull glow radiating from underneath his bloody carapace. The soul governor. Pain seared her soul as he once again tried to break her control over the device, forcing her to drop the barrier. She pulled in more energy from the wells beneath her. She couldn't see the creature's face, as it was covered by several inches of solidified blood, but she could sense him smiling. She drew in even more energy. She knew that if she drew too much, it would do permanent damage to her soul, like breaking a dam and letting the floodwaters rush through for a short time, but leaving a barren wasteland in its wake. She didn't care. She pushed energy out of one hand, throwing the Zealot against the wall outside of the room, while still floating over the fountains and drawing energy from them with her other hand. She kept pushing, holding him back against the wall several feet from the floor. He continued to batter against the soul governor, and it took every fiber of her being to hold back his soul and his body. She watched in horror as the thick armor that covered his face began to melt away and run down to his chest, where it coagulated as a razor-sharp needle that began growing out towards her. He had a young face with a wild and wicked smile stretched across it. The needle protruding from his chest got ever closer, growing at a rapid rate. It was merely feet away from her now. If she didn't move, it would pierce her heart.
What will it be, Warden? Will you die here protecting your governor? Or will you fight me with honor?
He said softly through his smile.
Honor? How many innocents have you butchered tonight?
They are anything but innocent,
he shouted in response. The needle slowed inches from Ellen Shaya, threatening to kill her with every breath. No, she would not die like this. She would die on her own terms. She knew what she had to do. She pulled, drawing up every last ounce of magical power in the reservoirs below her. She felt alive. Her eyes began to glow a bright white with power, and then she pushed. The wall behind the Zealot began to bend and buckle until the boards eventually snapped and splintered as she threw him through the wall. And the one behind that, and the one behind that. The wells were dull now, all of their energy pulsing through Ellen Shaya's body. She shot out of the room, flying through the massive holes that she had carved. She saw him, slumped against another wall, struggling to stand. She sped up and collided with him, shattering the last wall and launching him down into the ballroom below. He crashed down into the center of the room that was covered in blood. The handful of nobles that remained there all scrambled towards the edges of the room, except for one. One boy knelt near the end of the room, face blank, cradling the head of a deceased older noble in his lap. Fool, he should be running with the rest of them. Elenshia floated downwards, still radiating with energy, until she was only levitating a few feet from the ground. The energy burned brightly within her, though she felt it draining rapidly. She would not be able to last long like this, and once the power was exhausted, she would probably die. Hopefully, it would be enough. The zealot stood slowly, blood once again covering his face.
How many men, women, and children have you killed in the name of your false god, Warden?
False god? Broken is a god of order and protection. Your god is one of chaos and death. Grom is not my god.
His bloody armor pulsed around him, reacting to his anger. Even with all the energy she held, she still felt the Soul Governor on the brink of shattering.
Everyone that I have killed, I have done in the name of peace. You only kill for power. My people have done nothing to you for centuries, and yet you hunt us like animals. We just want to be left alone.
She did her best to hide the terror she felt as the gems of his Soul Governor began to crack under the immense power that radiated from him. She knew she needed to do something fast before her power gave out.
We will hunt the children of Crom, no matter what form they take. You are animals, bloodthirsty monsters. Your dark magic is a blight on the land, one that we will extinguish.
She shot towards him in a flash, blasting him with hot white energy that melted his armor away, though he healed and replaced it just as fast. He manifested a hammer made from blood in his hand and slammed it against her side as she flew past him, throwing her to the ground. She recovered her footing and threw another burst of energy against him. Wardens were proficient at defensive magic. They made wards and barriers to protect people. She was not suited for combat like this. She erected a barrier around her and began blasting him with energy, but he kept siphoning blood from his earlier victims that still lay nearby. He battered against her barrier, draining her energy with every hit. With one final blow from his hammer, he shattered the barrier and rushed towards her, grabbing her by the face and throwing her through a table. She reached her hand up to her face and felt blood dripping from a cut that he had inflicted. Her sight blurred as she felt the poison begin to take hold. He had poisoned his own blood in order to poison her. The power began to fade even faster. She rose back up into the air and bombarded him with everything she had. A constant beam of blinding light struck him in the chest. His armor began to melt away from his extremities as he forced it to his chest to reinforce the spot where she continued to blast away. He couldn't have much blood left, and without being able to touch the blood around him, he wouldn't be able to gain more. He would burn his own soul soon, if she could just hold on a little longer. Her energy faded, and the light dimmed from her eyes. They both collapsed to the floor. Had she done it? Had she actually won? She struggled to turn her head towards him, where she watched with horror as the blood trickled down her cheek and began to drip. It didn't drip to the floor below, however. Instead, it fell towards the zealot as he began to pull on the blood surrounding them. It rushed towards him in an instant. He rose up several feet from the ground with blood flowing around him violently. She had failed, and his Soul Governor was broken. She strained to try and signal her paladin that the hemomancer was coming, but she wasn't able to feel him. In fact, she wasn't able to feel anything. Her magic, her soul, was gone. Panic set in, and she called out to the monster that had just defeated her.
What are you waiting for? Do it! Kill me!
He simply stared at her as the reality of her situation fully sank in.
Please! Finish it! You can't leave me like this, please!
He glanced at her one last time, and then shot back through the hole in the wall that they had made.